What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back for another discography ranking for you guys. It's been about a month since I've done a discography ranking. I believe the last one we did was for Dark Throne. So after the Dark Throne ranking came out, I put up a poll on the community tab of my YouTube page asking from you guys, what band would you guys like to see me do a discography ranking for next? And you all have spoken, and with an overwhelming victory, the band we are talking about is one of my all-time favorite bands, and a band I was wanting to do a discography ranking for anyways, but I wasn't sure of when I would do it, but you guys have spoken. We are talking about legendary Bay Area thrash legends, Testament. Obey! So now, as far as how I got into Testament, this would have been around the time of when I was towards the end of middle school, heading into high school, like 2008, 2009 period. This was when I was really starting to get into a little bit more of the extreme metal side, at first starting with thrash. Like, I was already into Metallica and Megadeth long beforehand, but around 2008 and 2009, I was starting to discover more about Anthrax, and then getting more into Slayer, and then discovering the other thrash bands from the States at the time, like Exodus, of course, Testament, Overkill, among many others, and discovering more thrash in general. And also helps that the Get Thrashed Story of Thrash Metal documentary was out there, and I was watching it, and got into more bands in the thrash scene out of that. But as far as like when I really got into Testament more full on, it was freshman, sophomore year of high school, so like 2009, 2010 period. Like Formation of Damnation was the album out at the time, so I got into some of that, and then going back and listening to albums like The Legacy and The New Order and Practice What You Preach, Souls of Black, among those early classics from Testament, and that's how I basically become a Testament fan to this day, and been keeping up with what they've been doing ever since. And here we are doing a discography review. But before we get to that, let's talk about the history of this band prior to their debut. So this band originally formed out of San Francisco, California in 1983 with the name Legacy. And the original lineup consisted of, well, as far as like the classic original lineup, you had Steve Zetro-Sousa on vocals, Alex Skolnick on lead guitar, who was a Joe Satriani guitar student, Eric Peterson on rhythm guitar, Greg Christian on bass, and Louis Clemente on drums. Now, during this period, a couple other members would come in, like Derek Ramirez would come in, Mike Ronchet on drums for about a year or so, but the core original lineup was Zetro, Alex, Eric, Greg, and Louis. And we're playing a bunch of live shows in the Bay Area along with their fellow Bay Area and LA thrash contemporaries like Metallica, Exodus, Death Angel, Forbidden, Violence, Dark Angels, Slayer, Laz Rocket, Metal Church, among many others in the scene at the time. And recorded their first and only demo in 1985, and then in 1986... we get a big departure from the band as Steve Zetro-Sousa decides to leave to go front Exodus after Exodus had split themselves from Paul Bailoff, so Steve took up the opportunity to go over there to sing for Exodus, and who would they get to replace him? They would find a gentleman by the name of Chuck Billy to come in on vocals, and while I do like Steve Zetro-Sousa, I think I like Chuck Billy a little bit more, so I think this was an upgrade. I felt like in terms of the vocalist, because Chuck, I think, has got a more broader, wider vocal style and vocal range, I would say, than Zetro, even though I love Zetro to death, no doubt, but I like Chuck Billy a little bit more. So this is the lineup we got going, and in 1986 as well, they would get signed off of the momentum of their demo and their live shows, would get signed to Megaforce Records over in New Jersey, by Johnny and Marcia Zazula, who had already signed in the past Metallica and Anthrax and Overkill, among many others, during that time period. And the band would actually fly over to New York to do the recording for their debut album. However, just before the album was set to come out, the band found out there was a jazz band out there called The Legacy, and they had trademarked the name. So, according to former That Metal Show host and legendary radio DJ Eddie Trunk, who was actually an employee for Mega Force at the time, excuse me, and he described it that they were having the problems with the record coming out because of the jazz band trademarking the name. So the band was sitting around trying to come up with ideas, and it was Billy Milano from Method of Destruction and Stormtroopers of Death who suggested the name Testament, and everybody liked it and it stuck, and that's what they've been known since. So now, kind of ironic that I'm recording and releasing this video the 35th anniversary on the date of when this album came out. April 21st, 1987 on Megaforce Records, we get the release of The Legacy. The Legacy is right off the bat, this is my #1 Testament album. Not only for nostalgic reasons, because this was one of the first Testament albums I really got into, but I think objectively, as far as material, top to bottom, this was the best work the band has ever done. And they've made a lot of amazing albums since, but The Legacy was just such an amazing debut, and it's one of the greatest debuts, not just in thrash, but in metal in general. Like, holy shit, in the production, despite the crazy reverb, but hey, it was the 80s, and I don't mind reverb in metal. The production was fantastic, as it was produced by Alex Perialis, who had already produced for bands such as Anthrax, Carnivore, Overkill, SOD, among many other bands in not only thrash, but in metal as a whole. So, great choice with the producer, and he really brought out the sound in this band. This album sounds incredible. Starting right off the bat with one of the most classic songs in thrash with Over the Wall, with a cool music video that was on MTV, Headbangers Ball at the time. A really cool video. Other great tracks like The Haunting, Burnt Offerings, Curse of the Legions of Death. It's such a barn burner. Alone in the Dark, showcasing a little bit more of their melodic side. And Apocalyptic City, kind of combining the melodic side and the brutal side of Testament's sound. And just everybody just unleashed. And of course, Alex Skolnick's leads. Need I say more? I mean, his leads are fucking sultry, feeling, melodic, yet technical and heavy. What more can I say? The Legacy, for me, the all-time benchmark album for Testament throughout the rest of their career. But moving on, we go just a year later, so pretty quick pace. So they had done tours and shows in support of The Legacy, and then would go back to the studio in 1988 for their second album, and released in 1988, we get The New Order. The New Order is my #2 album. It was very, very close, but The New Order falls to #2, but it's another thrash classic. Some people might have this as their #1. It's always between The Legacy and The New Order in terms of what is the best Testament album. And really, there's no wrong answer with either of them. I just like The Legacy a little bit more, and I think it's just slightly better than The New Order. But The New Order is a fantastic album with songs like Day of Reckoning, The Preacher, The New Order, the music video for Trial by Fire that also got some play on Headbangers Ball at the time. But other great songs like Disciples of the Watch, Obey, just fucking barn burner songs. And even two instrumentals that were really cool, like Hypnosis, which was only 2 minutes, but it served to be the lead-in to Disciples of the Watch. And then Musical Death, like that is one of my personal favorite metal instrumental songs of all time. It's a beautiful, dark melodic, somber piece of music, and it was a hell of a way to close out a fucking fantastic album. And, of course, the backstory was when they originally sent it to Megaforce, it was like 35 minutes, and they said, no, we need almost or at least 40 minutes. So they threw on a cover of Aerosmith's Nobody's Fault. Maybe not the greatest cover song of all time, but I like it. I thought it was solid, but maybe if they would have left that off and made Hypnosis and Musical Death longer, I think it would have filled out the material right there. But still, New Order, fantastic follow-up. my number 2. So, keeping on with the routine, playing some shows, doing a tour in support for the New Order, and then right back to the studio we go in 1989. Now, I should preface that I believe around this time, Testament would sign over to Atlantic Records. So they're now on a major label, and this was during the time when thrash bands were really catching or not really catching momentum, but had become such a phenomenon that the major labels wanted a piece of the action. Because up to this point, you had Anthrax on Island Records with Among the Living, you had Metallica on Elektra with Master of Puppets, Slayer on Def Jam / American Recordings with Rain and Blood, and even underground masterminds like Rigor Mortis was on Capitol Records for their debut. Megadeth was eventually on Capitol Records with Peace Sells. So this was during the thrash major label gold rush period, I would say. And it was a great time for the scene because they were getting more record sales, more recognition, and bigger tours, like Metallica doing the Ozzy tour in '86. But that's beside the point, and I digress. So with Testament now on a major label with Atlantic Records, they go into the studio and record in 1989 and released later in 1989, Practice What You Preach. Now, this one falls for me. This one fell to number 10 for me. Although I do like this album, there are quite a few songs I do enjoy on this, but I think the problem this album suffers from is a lack of intensity on a lot of these tracks, but the songs that stood out to me on this album were, of course, the title track, Practice What You Preach, which is one of the best metal thrash songs of all time, with an amazing solo. But then again, any solo you hear Alex Skolnick do is going to be fantastic, so I might as well not even keep saying it. But also the ballad, which was their first softer song, I really, really like that. But a couple other tracks like Blessed Contempt, Greenhouse Effect I like, even though the lyrics were maybe a little too preachy. And this was a shift in the lyrical direction. Like the first two albums dealt with more of the occult and witchcraft, Dungeons and Dragons kind of stuff. Here with Practice What You Preach, you get into more political and social climate stuff, war and all that kind of shit. And Greenhouse Effect, yeah, that song, musically it's fantastic, but lyrically, little too preachy for my taste. Like, okay, I guess I won't drive. But other greats, I also really liked Envy Life and Nightmare Coming Back to You. There's even some like prog bits in the song Confusion Fusion, but I think the problem was they were kind of going through a bit of an identity crisis with their sound because, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of intensity on this album, and I think they were kind of enjoying the labors of their success, but to their credit, it worked because they eventually charted on Billboard, I think in the top 100, and got 2 music videos out of it for the title track and the ballad. So from that standpoint, it was a commercial success, but from a music standpoint, didn't quite hold up to the Legacy or the New Order. And that's why this album fell to number 10 for me. But keeping on with the routine, the band would get back on the road to do shows and do a tour, and then would return to the studio in, I believe, late 89, early 1990. And released in 1990, we get the 4th album, Souls of Black. This one's my number 9. I do think this is a really good album, definitely a big step up from Practice What You Preach, because this kind of felt like a mixture of the first 3 albums. Like, it brought back the thrash intensity of the Legacy and the New Order, but mixing in that more mainstream idea with Practice What You Preach. So it was a good combo of the two, and I think it worked out. Songs like the title track, Malpractice, One Man's Fate, and the song The Legacy, which is maybe one of my favorite ballads of all time. I know this song in and out. It's such an emotional song. And fucking Alex Skolnick, I know I keep talking about his lead work, but here and then on another song I'm going to talk about after this album, he makes the guitar fucking cry in the song The Legacy. It's just awesome. But yeah, it just was number 9 just because I like so many other albums of theirs a little bit more. But this is a really good one. A hell of a kind of a return to form a little bit for the band because, yeah, Practice What You Preach, like I said, lacked intensity. Here they got the intensity back, but mixed it with that more mainstream style, and it was done perfectly well, I would say. But yeah, Souls of Black, my number 9. And I need a drink of water for this. So moving on, they actually went for a big tour after Souls of Black came out. They were part of one of the biggest thrash tours of all time over in Europe, and that was the Clash of the Titans tour with Slayer, Megadeth, and Suicidal Tendencies. And they were on this tour in support of Souls of Black, and even opened for Judas Priest on the Painkiller tour, so that's why longer gap in between albums here, because they got to do 2 huge tours, Clash of the Titans and then opening for Priest, which that had to have been really cool for them, considering Judas Priest is one of the biggest influences on Testament. So after those tours, the band takes a bit more time in the studio when recording this next album, and released in 1992, we get The Ritual. The Ritual, this is my number 3 album. I know this album's really divisive among many Testament fans. This is an album that I don't think anybody thinks it's bad. It's like they either say this is awesome or this is a solid album. I think this is a great album, and yeah, it represented a shift in the band's sound, because around this time, you know, Metallica had the Black Album, and Megadeth had Countdown to Extinction, where they kept the thrash roots, but became a little bit more akin to classic metal, to get it onto the mainstream a little bit, and get some radio hits, and sell more albums. And while those two did it very, very well, but keeping the heaviness of the music intact, Testament kind of decided to follow suit into that, and while I would say this album is a little bit heavier, in my opinion, than Souls of Black, because they tuned down to E-flat for this album to kind of give this album a bit more of a darker, more sinister vibe to it. And in its sense, this album did do its job. It reached number 55 on Billboard, and they actually had 2 charting singles, Return to Serenity and Electric Crown, and both of those songs are fantastic, and both got music videos. Granted, Return to Serenity was a little bit later, but Electric Crown was a big, big hit on Headbangers Ball during this time. Now, like I said, I think the reason why this album is a little bit divisive in terms of people's feelings towards it is because they went away from being straight up thrash and into more classic metal terrain, where I think this was, in terms of bands that were trying to follow suit with Metallica and Megadeth and what they did, Testament definitely did it better than any other band that tried to follow suit into that, because Alex and Eric are such great songwriters. They can really write pretty much anything and make it sound good. But yeah, aside from those 2 singles, I actually really like this album top to bottom. Maybe my least favorite would be the song Deadline. It was just kind of but you get So Many Lies, which I think is an absolute banger of a song. The title track's kind of more of a doom metal song because it's really slow and evil and dark. Troubled Dreams is a hell of a closing song for me. Let Go of My World, As the Seasons Gray. Yeah, I really, really like this album. Despite some other friends of mine feeling like this album's more towards the bottom, I think it deserves more credit. I think this is the most underrated Testament album. I think more people should give this album another chance, and they might like it, because I like how it's darker, more sinister, and I love the more melodic approach, because Testament knows how to do melodies very, very well. And while this did cause some tension within the band in terms of the writing going forward, I thought this album was fantastic, and that's why it lands as my number 3. But shortly after the release of The Ritual, both Louis Clemente and Alex Skolnick would leave the band for different reasons. And who do they get to replace each guy? Well, for drums, they would eventually pick up John Tempesta, who was a drummer already in the past for Exodus, but would also drum for Rob Zombie, White Zombie, among many other bands, The Cult. So definitely a good choice in terms of the drummer replacement. And then for guitars, after Alex Skolnick left, they would pick up legendary death metal session guitarist James Murphy, who came from Death and Obituary, Cancer, Disincarnate. So another good choice in terms of a guitar replacement. And released in 1994, after spending time in the studio, we get the release of Low. This is another big shift in the band's sound, because given the time period in this time, 1994, thrash was kind of on a bit of like a stagnant hiatus, because a lot of the bands, like I said, had either been broken up or had changed their style up a little bit to kind of remain relevant, like Metallica and Megadeth, and even Overkill kind of changed their sound a little bit. And also at this point, groove metal was the flavor of the day in terms of metal styles, from Pantera and Sepultura and White Zombie, kind of taking hold of metal at this point in terms of what was the most popular style. So Testament decided to kind of get to more of a groove metal sound, but kind of bringing in a little bit of the old thrash roots back. But this is more of a groove metal album. Even a little bit of elements of death metal kind of come in here. Now, Low for me is my number 11. It's my second to last. Though I don't dislike this album. I actually think this is a really good album. It's just falls towards the bottom just because I just like the other albums more. But there are some good songs on here, like the title track, which is a very heavy opener with Chuck Billy doing death growls. And I do love Chuck Billy's death growls. He can overuse them at times, but up until this point, he didn't really use it. If at all, it was very sparingly, maybe for like a gang vocal or to pump up some lyric. But you didn't really hear him do death growls that much until you got to this album. And yeah, the opening title track definitely showcasing that. But other good songs like Shades of War, Dog-Faced Gods, which is another heavy fucking single. And even the song Trail of Tears was a great, like, melodic dirge of a song. And honestly, I feel like this could have been on The Ritual, this song, and it would have fit perfectly. But it was a nice, really cool track on here. But the rest of the album, like, the songs just kind of blended together for me. But those that I mentioned were the standouts for me personally on this album. But I have it at number 11. It's not a bad album. It's actually really good. It just falls to the other albums that I just liked more. So that's really all there is to it. Now, after Low had come out, the band was eventually dropped by Atlantic Records, and eventually Eric Peterson and Chuck Billy would form their own label called Burnt Offering Incorporated. And eventually John Tempesta and James Murphy and even Greg Christian would leave the band, leaving only Eric and Chuck left. So in 1997, they would get back to the studio for a new album, and for members, Derek Ramirez comes back and he would play bass on this album. We would get Glenn Alvarez from Forbidden, fellow Bay Area thrash legends, to come in on lead guitar, and for drums, why not? Let's go for the atomic clock himself, Mr. Mean Gene Hoglan, who had already up to this point was in Dark Angel and was just done with the band Death, and now he's here in Testament, which, good move on Eric and Chuck's part to get Gene, and released in 1997, we get the album Demonic. Now, Demonic is my dead last one. It's my number 12. I don't think it's necessarily a terrible album. It's more of a meh album to me. And this was another big shift in the band's sound. Now, given that this point in the metal history timeline, nu metal was the new genre of the day that was starting to come up and take over. And like even groove metal was running its course by this point. And so they decide to make an almost death metal album? And I don't know. It's like, you would think Testament could do death metal really well, and there are a couple of decent songs on here, like Demonic Refusal and Murky Waters. But for the most part, this album just kind of felt cluttered and all over the place. And them trying to go into death metal at this point, which, like I said, nu metal was taking over, groove metal was running its course, and they picked the wrong genre to go after for a new sound, because by this time, like, death metal wasn't the prettiest girl at the prom come the late 90s, even though it dominated the underground in the early 90s. Even though I still feel like when people say death metal faded into obscurity at this point is extremely hyperbolic. But I digress. But it's like, this is, like, in the songwriting department prior to this, like, especially in the classic run, it was Peterson and Skolnick, and when it came down to lead work, it was like a 70-30, 60-40 split, more in favor of Alex. This album was like 90% Eric Peterson, and this was his first crack at doing leads by himself, and not the best. There's a lot of squealy dive bombs that remind you of Kerry King solos. Now, I will say, by this point now in the band's history, like, I will say Eric Peterson's a better solo guitarist than Kerry King. But, yeah, this album, lead work-wise, was not very good. And while I do love Chuck Billy's death growls, I like them when they get broken up by his trademark thrash bark or even his melodic vocals. But this album was mostly his death growls, and yeah, it gets very static after a while, given how we know Testament can be and what they had been in the past. But yeah, Demonic, dead last. Not a terrible album, but not that good either. Kind of a stinker right here. So, yeah, dead last. And let me get another drink. So, after the spit of a mess that was Demonic, Glenn Alvarez, Derek Ramirez, and Gene Hoglan would leave the band, and Gene would actually leave to go join Strapping Young Lad with Devin Townsend and company. And as far as who they would get to perform on the other instruments, well, James Murphy would come back to play lead guitar. Why'd they let him go in the first place? I don't know. But he comes back to play leads. Steve DiGiorgio, who was already a legendary bass player in bands like Sadus, Autopsy, and Death, he comes in to play bass. And for drums, why not get the greatest metal drummer in the history of metal, the one and only Dave Lombardo from Slayer. So, practically a supergroup is what we get for this album, and released in 1999, and also this album would be the first of many albums to be produced by Andy Sneap, or worked on by Andy Sneap. Released in 1999, we get The Gathering. This is my number 7 album. This is a fantastic album, and still a little bit of elements of the groove metal from the past 2 albums, but I think it was better executed on here, and still having a little bit of the death metal vibe from Demonic, but again, more well-performed, well-written. So this is kind of almost like a hybrid of death metal and groove metal, but it's still largely just a thrash album. Like, they got back to the thrash point. Now, around this time, 1999, heading into the 2000s, you start to hear some of the classic thrash bands go back to their roots by this point. And this is one of those albums that kind of went back to their roots. And The Gathering, I mean, songs like Legions of the Dead, which is a fast barn burner of a song, 3 Days in Darkness, Fall into Sipple-Dome. There's tons of great tracks on here. And of course, Chuck Billy's vocals, kind of back to the balance of the growls and the bark and the melodic stuff. And man, just everybody came in and unleashed hell on this album. And this album is my number 7. Fucking great stuff. However, unfortunately, after The Gathering came out, some bad shit starts to happen in the Testament camp. First, Chuck Billy is diagnosed with, sickle cell, something like some kind of form of cancer. And eventually he would get the open heart surgery to help the cancer out, and he's thankfully still here to this day, cancer-free, and still kicking ass. But also around the same time, James Murphy suffers a brain tumor, but eventually would raise enough money to get the tumor treated. However, that meant he wasn't going to be touring anymore, and is now just limited to just being a session guitarist rather than a touring guitarist. But thankfully, James is alive and healthy and still with us kicking ass to this day. So, after this, it pretty much put the band on a bit of a hiatus. Even though they were still active together, they kind of laid dormant for a while, and would eventually start writing material of what would be their next album as early as about 2005, 2006 time period. And by this point, we get a new lineup. Greg Christian comes back on bass. Alex Skolnick comes back on lead guitar, which was awesome. And for drums, they would pick up former Forbidden and Slayer drummer Paul Bostaph to come in on drums, which was another good move. And finally released in 2008, we get The Formation of Damnation. Like I said, this was the album released at the time when I was getting into Testament, and I discovered this album around this point, and it's fucking incredible. This is my number 4 album. This is one of the best comeback albums I have ever heard. And I'm saying comeback in the sense of how long it was between The Gathering to this, as well as all the bad stuff that was going on and how Chuck Billy fought the cancer off and how he's healthy. And man, you want to talk about unleashing brutality in thrash form. Holy shit, this album's fantastic and vicious and brutal and heavy. Another album, once again, worked on or produced by Andy Sneap, and really, I think this is when Andy Sneap really hit his stride as far as producing Testament stuff. I mean, top to bottom, this is some brilliant stuff. Like that intro for the Glory of, heading into More Than Meets the Eye, which was the big single. Fucking fantastic opener. And even songs like the title track, which is one of my favorite Testament songs, Afterlife, Killing Season with a nice killer groove to it, Fear, Leave Me Forever. I could just rattle off all the songs. Really, the only thing I don't care for or like about this album is the lyrics on The Evil Has Landed. Like, even though that song's a barn burner in terms of a song, lyrically it's like, give me a little more imagination in the lyrics. Like, But this album's absolutely fantastic. One of my favorites, and it's my number 4. So the band would get back into touring once again and toured heavily on this album. In fact, probably the biggest tour they ever did was the Metal Masters tour from 2008, I believe. Yeah, 2008, where they opened for Motorhead, Judas Priest, and Heaven and Hell, a.k.a. Dio-era Black Sabbath. So, massive tour for those guys, getting to be with 3 of the most legendary bands, Motorhead, Sabbath, and Priest. Just fucking fantastic for them. And they toured heavily on this album, and they didn't get back to the studio until 2011. And by this point, Paul Bostaph had left the band, and Gene Hoglan comes back into the band. And we would get another album in 2012. We get the release of Dark Roots of Earth. This is my number 5 album. Phenomenal follow-up to Formation of Damnation. And this album kind of felt like a combination of The Ritual and Formation of Damnation. Like, it brought back some of the dark melodic songs from The Ritual, but mixed it with that heavy thrash aggression of Formation of Damnation. So you get a nice blend of the two on this album. And when the songs got heavy, they got heavy. Songs like Rise Up, even though lyrically it's kind of dumb, it's more fitting for a live setting, but the song itself is amazing. The title track, kind of more sludgy and doomy oriented for the most part. True American Hate is a fucking thrashy barn burner. Native Blood, another great song with blast beats in the chorus. And thrash metal can do blast beats very well, and Gene Hoglan shows that off quite well. But other great songs like Cold Embrace, which is one of their softer songs. It's like most of the lyrics on this album revolve around the evil political stuff, but Cold Embrace stands out because it's about a girl who turns into a vampire and can no longer see the sun again. And even they admit that they wish they would have pitched this song to Twilight to be on the soundtrack for those movies. But other great songs like Last Stand of Independence, Day in the Death, which actually there are 2 versions of A Day in the Death, one with Gene on drums and one with Chris Adler from Lamb of God on drums, which is really interesting. And the version of this album I have has 3 cover songs. I believe Dragon Attack from Queen, Animal Magnetism from the Scorpions, and Power Slave by Iron Maiden. All 3 great cover songs, and they do them in their own way, and it's phenomenal. Yeah, Dark Roots. This was one of my favorites from 2012, and it lands as my number 5 Testament album overall. Once again, keeping on with the routine, they toured heavily on this album. However, around this time, Greg Christian would leave the band, and Steve DiGiorgio comes back, and again, practically a supergroup. You know, Chuck, Eric, Alex, Steve, and Gene. Practically a supergroup at this point. Once again, another 4 years would go by before we would get another studio album, and released in 2016... excuse me. But released in 2016, we get Brotherhood of the Snake. I actually reviewed this one when it came out, and this is my number 6 album. This band just was on a very good run here recently with albums, and Brotherhood the band kind of described it as their Rain and Blood, as in, like, this is one of the most intense, thrashy albums they've ever done. First half kind of was like still kind of dealing with the more melodic side of their sound, but the opening title track, fucking heavy beast with blast beats, cool breakdowns, catchy choruses, all the stuff. Seven Seals, once again, catchy cadences going on. But then you get into like Born in a Rut, which is this like almost, I don't want to say Motorhead, but it kind of had a bit of that feeling to it. But then you get to the second half of the album, and this is where it gets really intense and thrashy. Songs like Centuries of Suffering. Yeah, Can of Business is a little dumb as far as the lyrics, but the music itself, it's a thrashy barn burner. I forget the name of the final track. It's like, oh, The Pale King. That's another good track that I really liked on this album. I'm trying to remember the last track. The Number Game. That's another thrash barn burner. Neptune's Spear, Dark. Blackjack, another great thrashy tune with blast beats. I mean, top to bottom, this was a fantastic album. This was one of my favorites of 2016, and it's my number 6 overall for Testament. So once again, heavy touring going on for the band, and then released in early 2020, before all the pandemic stuff struck, they would release their most recent album, and that is Titans of Creation. This one's my number 8 album. It fell a little bit for me because, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that there were other albums I liked more, but for a while, I never got around to finishing this album. I don't know, there was just something about this album that kind of felt off for a while. But now, going back, I appreciate it a little bit more, and I do think it's really good. Not among their best, but I think it's a pretty good album. Songs like Night of the Witch, Children of the Next Level, that is a great song, all about that, called Heaven's Gate. Let's see, Curse of Harambe, that's a great track, but... wait, is it Curse of Harambe? Even I can't remember. Code of the Harambe. Curse of Osiris. That is a thrashy fucking track right there. One of my favorites of the more recent run of Testament. And also you get more Eric Peterson doing his like black metal vocals from his days and being in Dragonlord, which is still going but not producing much material. But you hear Eric Peterson do his like black metal vocals on Night of the Witch and Curse of Osiris. So yeah, this album, yeah, like I said, it falls only because there were just so many others that I liked more. But this is still really good. Definitely check it out if you're a fan of Testament. And once again, this was still with Andy Sneap helping out, and there you have it. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Testament ranking, and actually, as of right now, the lineup is Chuck Billy, Eric Peterson, Alex Skolnick, Steve DiGiorgio, and now Dave Lombardo is back in the band. So, will we get a new album here in a year or two with this lineup? I'd say we do, and I can't wait for it. I always look forward to new Testament songs, but what is your guys' favorite Testament albums? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know your ranking, what's your favorite, what's your least favorite, the whole 9 yards. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Horns high, and I will see you soon.
At the ballpark. Someone's gonna put lasagna.
I took it. Tomato. Okay, yeah, it's Levi. It's Levi.
Damn it.
I'm done. Could I?
I want to know what he got for this one.
Alright, Seth, let's go Tomato Town.
That is dying.
I would like a single slice of your greatest tomatoes
I
in
would
the
like
park.
your finest tomato, please.
Calm down, Seth. Calm down, Seth. Calm down.
Somebody vote.
No, it's
It's Levi. Levi's the one that has some
Levi is the majority.
Yeah.
Oh my lord.
That's breathe.
Oh,
Tomato. I'm gonna be really interested to see these prompts.
Yeah, like
Officer,
literally.
please escort me out of the ballpark. I just wanted to eat my tomato.